How do you design your gel press prints? Do you just sit down and let it organically evolve, or do you think about the final product that you have in mind, like what you're going to use it for? Today I'm using these for a set of 5 cards, and I specifically made the prints with those card designs in mind. I have lots of tips and tricks to share, so let's get started. The Colorado Craft Company Anita Jerram release is going to inspire all of my card designs today. This is the Love Art stamp set, and I decided, because it's all about art, that I needed to have a rainbow. So that's what I'm going to start off with my printing. Now, ultimately, I don't end up using this print, but I do end up using the leftover paint that's on the gel press for this. So it's important for me to show you this because you need to see how I've gotten those leftover parts. I will have all of the colors of the paint that I use listed in my blog post. There's a link for that down below. So be sure to join us on the blog hop. And of course, all of the supplies will be listed down below as well. So here I'm using Amsterdam acrylic paint, and I have Carmine, yellow ochre, phthalo green, cobalt blue, and I'll add ultramarine violet at the top here. Although I speed through applying the paint to the gel press, I will slow down the other areas so that I can talk a little bit more about the technique. So I'm just going to use a baby wipe here to soften some of the edges in between these different colors of paint. I felt like that was a really sharp edge, and I didn't want it to be quite so sharp. Here I have a rubbing plate, and I'm using that to lift paint off of the gel press. I'll go ahead and put a piece of paper over that quickly so I can lift that paint off of the rubbing plate and create another print. Here I have the 2 stamps from the Love Art stamp set, and I'm going to go ahead and lift off some paint here as well. Now here I'm pointing out that I pressed too hard and it pulled off the paint that was inside of the little small images, and so that was definitely not the look I'm going for, and you'll see that when I pull the final image why I discarded this print. So now that I've done some stamping, I've added a pattern. This paint, the rainbow paint, has dried quite a bit. In order to pull the print, because the paint is so dry, I need to add another layer of paint. Here I'm using white so I don't get any color mixtures. I want to make sure that it's nice and pure and that the rainbow colors are super vibrant. So I'm just blending that out. You only want a very thin layer of paint. It needs to be pretty much transparent so that you can see your first layer showing through. Now I knew I wasn't going to want to use this print because I pulled off too much paint with the stamp. So I let the white paint that I put on dry for about 30 seconds to get a little dry in some areas. I put on the paint really thin in some areas because I want to leave behind some of that rainbow that we had on the gel press, because that's going to add to the next print that I have in mind. So you can see that we've got some rainbow areas there that are left on the gel print, and I'm going to leave that there so I can pull it with the next print. So there's a lot going on here. You can't really read the image very well, and this just didn't turn out like I expected. So we're shifting gears, and what I want to have is a really light colored background with these pops of color from the leftover rainbow paint. So I'm switching to buff titanium. I'm going to put down a really thin layer of buff titanium here. So when you're putting your paint on, you want to run your brayer over the paint in one direction, lift your brayer with each stroke, and that's going to help rotate the brayer so that you get an even covering of paint on your brayer. It's going to give you nice smooth strokes. You can see that there is barely any paint on here. There's almost no paint at all. So the design I have in my head is a plaster wall with these pops of colors, like these little mice are actually painting these pops of colors on this very bland plaster wall. I did want to have some texture to it. I just didn't want it just to be complete plaster. There needs to be texture on it. And so I opted for Venetian rose. I brayered that paint onto this rubbing plate that has what looks like a rainbow pattern. I thought that would be really cool and add some focal areas. And I'll just, the rubbing plate is a little shorter than the 5x7 gel press, and so I'll just put a little more paint on and then continue that pattern up top. The super thin layer of buff titanium was completely dry before I put on these pink rainbows, and then I also let the pink rainbows dry a little bit. So I'm going to press the paper down and see if I can get a print off this, and sure enough, both of those layers, actually we have 3 layers now, are pretty much dry. Not much of anything came off on that paper. So now I'm going to add a super thin layer of Amsterdam Deep Gold. Now what's nice about this paint is it is actually pretty transparent. It's not going to darken up the print, but what it is going to do is wet those layers enough so that when I put the paper down, it's going to pull the print and pull up all of those layers of paint that we have on the gel press. So I'm going to grab a fresh sheet of paper. I'll go ahead and get that pressed down, and you do want to make sure that you press down all of the areas and then gently pull up your print, and we'll see how this goes. So what I'm hoping for is that kind of plastered wall look with some texture on it and these pops of color. This I think is going to be perfect for the stamp set that I'm going to use. So I'll just grab that stamp set, and I do like how that looks. I already had some black ink on there, so it was really easy to tell how that was going to look. Rather than do the stamping right away, I'm going to go ahead and pull another print before I get started. So now I have burnt sienna, and I'm just adding that to the top. I have the Venetian rose, which I used for the rainbows on the last card, and then I have Naples yellow at the bottom. I wanted to use the For Mom stamp set, and this one is of a little mouse in her cozy bed, and she's been brought breakfast in bed. You can see that here. I wanted to have some cozy colors, so I thought the burnt sienna and the Venetian rose would be a really nice feminine but cozy scene. So you can see I used a different rubbing plate there. I'll put on a layer of white to make sure that all of these textured layers are indeed wet. And I'll use that other piece of paper that I used because it had just a tiny bit of texture on it. That'll add a little bit more interest to this print. You can see I had just a little bit of that violet and cobalt blue left on there. This is a pretty, I wouldn't say boring piece, but it's going to work great for the stamp set that I'm going to use. So here are the first 2 prints, and we'll go ahead and do some stamping. For the first design, I thought maybe I would want to use as much of this background as I could. This is just another piece of 5.5 by 8.5 paper that I've just used a 4 1/4 by 5.5 die cut and cut out the center. This gives me a nice frame so I can visualize if I want this at a full A2 size or smaller. I went ahead and used a decal edge die to cut that out where I wanted it, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp these little guys onto this background with archival ink. When you're stamping on an acrylic surface, such as, I've done the gel press with acrylic paint, you want to use either an archival ink or a stays-on ink, stays-on pigment, something like that is going to be great for more of this non-porous surface. Now, of course, these little guys blend into the background pretty significantly, so I wanted to make sure that I gave them some shadow and tried to pop them off the page a little bit. So here I have Caran Neocolor 2 crayons, and I'm just using a wet paintbrush. I'm putting a little bit of Payne's Gray down and using a wet paintbrush to blend out that Payne's Gray to get a shadow going on at the base here. This is going to help to ground the image. It's also going to help to pop the image forward. And I'll do a little bit of coloring in various places. So I'll add some Payne's Gray and black to the mice, a little bit of white to the mice. I'll make sure to add color to the leaves and the stem and the tails of these little guys as well. These are a new product to me. I've only used them a couple of times, and so far I absolutely love them. I've only used them on the gel press printing so far. I haven't used them in other projects, but they re-wet beautifully and blend beautifully. And I wasn't sure if I would like them or not. So when I purchased them, rather than buying a set and investing in that, what I decided to do was just buy a couple of the colors from the open stock. So if you're trying to decide whether or not you want to invest in a new product, if they have open stock, that's what I would recommend. Buy a couple colors of the colors that you know you're going to love and test those out and see how you like them before you invest in a set. If you guys are learning something new, be sure to give me a thumbs up down below and consider subscribing. If you do subscribe, thank you very much, and make sure you hit that notification bell. One of the things that I've noticed from some of my subscribers is that even when they hit the notification bell, they don't always get notified. So be sure to check back in if you haven't seen a video from me in a while. I do read all of the comments that are left on my social media sites, so I love to hear from you guys. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you're new to my channel, I don't typically color critters. I mostly do florals, leaves, nature type things. I don't do a lot of critters, and that's why I actually chose to do mixed media with these today. One, I'm totally into mixed media right now and gel press printing, but two, I thought it would be less intimidating to add just little bits of color here and there to these images versus feeling like I had to perfectly Copic color or watercolor these images in more of a realistic fashion. So that's definitely something I recommend. So here we can see the finished coloring, and I love this card. I wish I had tilted it in the light a little bit more because the gold shine on this card is incredible, and I didn't pick it up in my photos. I adore this card, and I'm so happy with how creating the print with the card design in mind worked out. Here's the other card that I made in the same fashion. I die cut this one a little bit more and did use the crayons on this one as well. For the first two cards, I was working on a 5x7 gel press, and for the next couple cards, I decided to use these little mini sets, and for that, I'm using a 3x5 gel press. It's the perfect size to give these little critters an environment to live in. I wanted to switch over to a cool scene, one that was more nature. I wanted green at the bottom for grass, a little bit of buff titanium for a transition, and some Prussian blue at the top for the sky. And this time I'm opting for some swirls in the sky, which is going to mimic like wind, maybe clouds, and kind of just give you that feeling of movement. And the bottom, I'll add a couple swirls as well. And I transferred the blue ink from the top, or the blue paint from the top to the bottom. I felt like I needed a little bit more of a transition, so I've added some sky blue light to this, and I've put just a thin layer over it, over the blue on the top. For the bottom, to re-wet the green at the bottom, I'll just use a little bit of titanium white there. Again, you want to make sure that your last layer of paint is still wet so that you can pull your print. If it's too dry, you won't be able to get the paint off of the gel press. You can see how thinly I put the white paint on at the bottom because it didn't pull up all of that green paint. So I have some nice areas of white space both at the top, in the sky, and in the bottom. This gives me the opportunity to pull another print. This time I'm going to use contrasting colors. So up where the blue sky was, I'll put the green grass. Instead of using buff titanium, I have Naples yellow green for the transition color, and then Prussian blue at the top. And in fact, you guys, I might have used that Naples yellow green in the other print as well. That might not have been buff titanium. So I'll do the same thing. I'm going to transfer that blue ink down to the grass below, and I wanted to see what this looked like from behind, so I lifted this up. There are acrylic blocks that you can put your gel presses on so that you can lift it more easily, but I didn't have one of those. So I'm just going to print this right next to the other one that I've already printed off. I waited just a little bit for it to dry, and I'll pull that off. And we can see we've got nice texture, but I much prefer the first one with those bits of white space. So I'll go ahead and just tear this off. I want to have like a nice torn organic edge there, and I'm going to stamp on these little bunnies. This is called Snuggle Bunny. This also has a coordinating die. They looked a little lonely in the middle there, so I grabbed another stamp set, the Make-A-Wish Mini, and I'm just going to mask off the actual little mouse on there and just use the dandelions. That gives me a little bit more of a scene rather than just the little bunnies in the middle there. I'll go ahead and tear the rest of this, and this fits perfectly on an A2 size card, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I used the Payne's Gray to add just a little bit of shadow. Moving on to the next card, I thought I filmed this, you guys, and I didn't. I hit stop recording instead of record. So I went ahead and pulled a print with Caput Mortem, the sky blue, and then that olive green light. And I stamped this character from the Artist Mini, and I went ahead and Copic colored it. You can see my colors there. I'll list those in my blog post as well. I die cut part of the print with a decal edge die, and I die cut the little critters and the sentiment with the coordinating die set. And I love this one too. Okay, for the last card, I wanted to use a masculine color palette. So I have Prussian blue at the top. In the middle, I will use Naples yellow. And then at the bottom, I'm going to use Burnt Sienna again. And the reason I wanted a masculine color palette is because I'm using the stamp set Dad's Cooking, which is a Father's Day themed set. So I'm totally digging this color palette, and I'm transferring some of the extra paint over to the smaller gel press so that I can create 2 prints at once. And this time I'm adding texture with a different rubbing plate, and I'm using both sides of it. One side has thinner lines to the pattern, and the other side has broader lines. So it just gives you a little bit of a different look. Check out those colors. I absolutely love it. So right about at this point, I'm realizing I'm getting a little off track with my prints. Like, this pattern that's on here is a little overwhelming, and I'm not really sure how I would stamp an image on here. So I'm just going to play around with this a little bit. I let the first layer dry, and you can see I've added the white paint to this. I'll take off the excess, and I'll remove some of the paint with the stamp set. So I'll just pull off that paint. A little bit of the issue with this is it's too dry. It's not going to pull the print very well, but also I don't think lifting the ink was quite right for the colors that I used. So you can see it left a ton of paint left on here because the paint was just too dry when I pulled it. So I'm going to use a contrasting color and put Carmine over all of it. Now, I do wish I had added a textured pattern to this because there's definitely some areas of the Carmine where it just looks pretty boring and bland. I did add some pattern over there on the smaller gel press. I'll go ahead and pull this print, and I'm going to let the small gel press dry because I want to add a different color to that. So this is a pretty cool pattern. You can see just a little bit of the stamp there, so it's not going to be useful for the card per se. So I added a layer of Phthalo turquoise to the small gel press and put the extra paint over on the 5x7 gel press. Look how beautiful those colors are together. I love that. Now with this extra paint that's on the 5x7 gel press, I'm going to be able to turn this into the final card background. So I have really thin, light layer of, I think I called it Phthalo turquoise, but I think it's actually Phthalo green. I'll have the right color linked down below for you guys though. And now I'm adding Naples yellow green, a really thin layer. I'm going to put this super light beachy print on top of the Prussian blue, Naples yellow, and burnt sienna print that we had, and it's going to dull those colors back. And I love the vintage beachy look of that color palette. So now I have to figure out how to get my stamp on there. I didn't just want to stamp it in black and white. I thought that that would be kind of boring. So what I'm going to do is lift the ink off of this Prussian blue here. I thought maybe I would be able to stamp with that, but it's such a thin layer of Prussian blue on the smaller gel press that it dried very quickly. So instead what I decided to do is I'm going to get the excess paint off of the brayer, and once the brayer is dry and your layer of paint is dry, you can actually use the brayer to remove some of the paint. This is going to help give me some distressed edges because I want to transfer this print onto that beachy print that we just did, but I didn't want there to just be a blue block. I wanted the edges to be more organic. So you can see I'm just kind of working at the image and rolling the brayer over it to lift the ink. So now I'll go ahead and print this on that beachy one right down there at the bottom. And it doesn't need to be perfectly lined up or anything like that. Right about now, I'm hoping that it's still wet enough for it to pull the whole stamp up because it took me a while to get that extra ink off. And you can see that that worked out beautifully. So we have the light colors coming through from the bottom layers over this dark layer. And I think that that is such an awesome distressed look. I love this card, you guys. These colors really speak to me and I love all the texture. I hope that you guys enjoyed all these tips on how you can have a card design in mind before you go to your gel press and how to create prints that you're going to be able to put to use right away. So take a look at your stamp sets and start creating some gel press patterns for backgrounds for your stamps and incorporate your stamps into the gel press process. If you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up and a subscribe down below, and be sure to leave me a comment with your thoughts. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you soon with more inspiration.